We tend to picture cybersecurity as a giant digital wall, a thick layer of code designed to keep threats out. But if a sufficiently motivated adversary applies enough pressure, that wall will inevitably be breached. Treating network defense as a binary state of safe or hacked is a flaw in intuition. The modern security environment operates as a quantifiable mathematical domain. Relying purely on reactive software patches and static firewalls places the defense entirely at the mercy of the attacker's schedule. To genuinely defend a network, security architects must translate attacker behavior and system weaknesses into rigorous computational frameworks. The process begins at the absolute baseline. We isolate a single, specific cyber attack and measure the discrete variables that make it possible. From there, the scale expands to model dynamic, multi-stage threat campaigns that persist inside a network over time. Finally, those models are applied to the macro landscape to calculate how digital threats compound year over year. Securing a system requires abandoning gut feelings about safety and using probability theory to predict the threats we cannot see. Every complex security architecture rests on the ability to model a single, isolated breach. The deterministic risk model calculates risk as threat times vulnerability times impact. For example, a phishing threat of 0.8, a weak password vulnerability of 0.7, and a data leak impact of 0.9. Multiplying these probabilities yields a high-risk score of 0.504. A 0.504 result identifies this scenario as a high-priority risk. The compounded probability of the threat succeeding is now greater than a coin flip. This provides security teams with a concrete target. The objective is to drive this final number down as efficiently as possible. Because the model is multiplicative, eliminating a single variable is enough. If administrators enforce multi-factor authentication, the probability of that weak password being exploited drops to 0, bringing the total risk calculation down with it. Neutralizing one variable is more efficient than attempting to mitigate all three simultaneously. This deterministic equation dictates exactly how security operations prioritize their controls. That static equation works for isolated vulnerabilities. It is less effective when evaluating highly resourced adversaries, like nation-state actors. These actors deploy advanced persistent threats, or APTs. Instead of a single strike, an APT is a stealthy, long-term campaign designed to embed inside a network. The standard APT lifecycle moves through distinct sequential stages: reconnaissance, initial access, persistence, lateral movement, and data exfiltration. To map an attacker's progression across these specific stages, we apply discrete mathematics, modeling each step as a state transition. We calculate these transitions using a stochastic framework called a Markov chain. The defining rule of a Markov chain is that the probability of moving to the next stage depends entirely on the attacker's current state. Look at the transition between initial access and persistence. Based on historical data, we assign a transition probability of 0.6. This dictates that once an attacker gains initial access, there is a 60% mathematical likelihood they will successfully establish a permanent foothold. But the defense calculates its own metrics. During this specific transition phase, the probability of detecting the attacker might sit at 0.3. Security engineers weigh these opposing probabilities to pinpoint where the attacker is statistically most vulnerable, determining exactly where to deploy AI-based intrusion detection systems. Treating attacker behavior as a stochastic process allows defenders to quantitatively break the chain of a long-term breach before it reaches exfiltration. Individual APTs and isolated vulnerabilities do not exist in a vacuum. To understand the security environment, we have to zoom out. The current global landscape is highly volatile. It is constantly accelerated by AI-automated attacks, ransomware as a service, and millions of expanding IoT networks. Tracking these industry-wide trends requires abandoning discrete math. We must utilize continuous exponential growth models. This graph illustrates the continuous exponential growth function, NFT. We start with a baseline of 1,000 initial attacks in year 0, 2020. Driven by automated toolkits, we apply an annual growth rate of 20%. Using this continuous growth model, we can project the exact volume of incoming attacks just 5 years later. The math yields a certainty. By year 5, the system faces 2,718 attacks, nearly triple the original volume. This macro-level expansion directly impacts micro-level defenses. When subjected to triple the volume of attacks, a seemingly minor software vulnerability becomes a critical liability. In an exponentially growing threat landscape, tiny, unpatched vulnerabilities will inevitably compound into large-scale systemic breaches over time. Defending the modern digital ecosystem requires mastering all 3 levels of mathematical abstraction. In application, we must always account for the persistent reality that the human factor will remain the weakest link in any system. This summary board illustrates the complete framework. While human behavior is unpredictable, the mechanisms attackers use to exploit those humans are entirely quantifiable. Static risk manages the foundational baseline, Markov chains map the sophisticated attacker, and exponential mathematics project the broader landscape. Feeding these mathematical models into AI-driven systems gives security teams the analytical capacity to foresee attacks before they happen. This shifts the focus from broad IT patching to a targeted strategy based on the specific risk scores we have calculated. Modern cybersecurity prioritizes calculating probabilities over the traditional reliance on software barriers. Mastering the security environment means shifting away from reactive crisis management and committing entirely to proactive risk quantification.